Abuji, Abuji, Abuji.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the next show of Maja House. Uh, we have been hosting uh, performers, artists, poets, authors for the last about 2 years online, and we have seen a great lot of many good poets. A couple of weeks ago, we also had a few, but this time we have got SUDEEP Sen with us. Though he'll be the chief performer, but I guess his interlocutor, uh, Ravi Shankar, is equally good poet. Uh, though our uh, main guest today is SUDEEP Sen. Um, Maja House has been hosting these uh, men of letters or women of letters and um, other celebrities uh, nearly every week. And we have today with us Sudeep Sen, who is um, a poet, a translator, an editor, and of course, an artist also. We have met him before, but this time I guess he will be introduced here as largely a poet. Uh, he's a highly decorated poet. He has produced award winning collections of poetry, and that includes names like Postmarked, India, Rain, Arya, Blue Nude. And the good news is that his poetry has been translated in about 25 languages. Just now, he has shown us the book, which has been translated in Punjabi, which he says is the work of his last 40 years. Good. Thank you very much, Sudeep. And this work has been done by some Punjabi poets who have translated his work. He is not only a poet, but also a translator. He has done translation of Kafi Azmi's poems and nazms, and he has also been an editor. He has done this HarperCollins book of English poetry, which I think is kind of is a inventory of the poets of recent years. He has also been a photographer, which I think very few would probably know that, and he has produced a couple of books of his photography. And not only this, he has featured on almost all major newspapers and magazines in this country and abroad. Um, his writings, not only poetry, other writings also have appeared in major newspapers in this country, including some of the international magazines also. He has been awarded, very heavily. I would just like to name one or two. A.K. Ramanujan Translation Award is one I think he's been very proud of. And the most important thing about him is that uh, he has this rare distinction of being at a Nobel Laureates Week, where Derek Walcott was there, and he had his poems read in his presence. Uh, Interlocuting with him today would be Ravi Shankar as well as Preeti Gill. Ravi Shankar is an equally eminent and prize-winning poet. He is also a professor, an author, an editor, and a translator. His poems too have been translated in about 15 languages. The list of his awards is very long. I'll just give a brief uh, idea about it. And he has produced so far about 15 books. And the names of his awards are like this: Pushcart Prize, the Muse India Award, the National Poetry Review Award, Carolina Wren Judges Award, Gulf Coast Poetry Award, and he has been translated in about 12 languages, as I told you already. Both of these poets are not only poets, they have been also scholars and visitors to major universities in the world, including major universities in US and Europe and Australia. Ravi Shankar, anyway, is also teaching in one of the universities, University of Sydney in Australia nowadays. And he has also written, his writings have appeared in such eminent journals as New York Times. Preeti Gill is the founder and the brain behind Maja House. Whatever is happening at Maja House is happening only because of her. Thanks good. Yes, she needs that kind of cheering, because Amritsar is a kind of as they say, is in the back of nowhere, and yet she has been able to rehabilitate this place with this kind of cultural and literary programs. We have been running them almost every week, I think, which is a very difficult task. But she has been organizing and arranging people, inviting them. And in the process, we have been able to run a very large series of successful programs. In her own right, she is also a writer, an editor, a literary agent for the last about 25 years. She has produced documentaries on Northeast. That's the area she kind of specializes in. And one of her books is very popular. It's very interesting. We had a chance of reading some bits of it. She Stoops to Conquer. That's a set of stories by women. And these are stories about crime and suspense. So we have this glittering company this evening. And I think you are going to have a whale of a time. I'll now hand over to Ravi Shankar to start this conversation with SUDEEP Sen. Thank you very much for being with us. And I think I leave the floor to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you, Preeti. Maja House is doing some amazing work. So I'm glad to be part of this celebration of SUDEEP's work, Anthropocene. And hopefully everyone has seen a copy. I've, over the last few weeks, been spending a lot of time with it. And first, let me say congratulations, SUDEEP. It's a beautiful accomplishment. And there's so many things that I want to talk about, but maybe we can kind of begin with you talking a little bit about the inception of this book. It's really, truly, if those of you who haven't seen it, it's a hybrid work in a lot of ways, because it almost has kind of a short nonfiction essay, and then it has everything from haiku and prose poems to poems with caesuras, even some found objects, some actual, I think, a clipping from the New York Times. There's some drawings. And so it's a kind of pastiche of many different kinds of work. So how did you come about this particular project? And I have a feeling climate change has been something that's been on your mind for a long time.
Ravi, it's a treat to be talking to you. We've been friends for I don't know how many decades, and have read together and done things together. And you're such an attentive reader of poetry in general, not just mine, but in general, and such a fine editor. So it's a delight to be talking to you. So the structure of the book, when I first started writing it, I never thought it's going to be a whole book. I tend to write in bursts. And during the lockdown, of course, there was not much else one could have done except read and write. Isolation is something that people talk about in the lockdown, but that's again something that's very, very normal for me, because most of a given day even in normal circumstances, I'm isolated in my study. It's only in the evenings that I might venture out. But the structure sort of aggregated itself in a sort of organic way. There were different types of things I was doing. And I realized that because the pandemic is so divisive, so fragmented, the politics around us is also so fragmented. It's just a very, very unusual time. So for an unusual time, it's actually not a bad idea to have an unusually structured book. Otherwise, what tends to happen, especially for poets, is we have to sift our poetry out and publish it in a volume. But we are talking about similar issues, using so many different genres. Of course, nonfiction, fiction, and poetry is just three of them. But as you allude to it, to me, the entire aspect of images in terms of looking at images, so photography, design, typography, layout, white space, what you leave out on the page is equally important than what you put in. So when eventually I had the whole collection of poems, of course, 80% of it has been written during the pandemic. And it's unusual in that sense because I normally sort of sit with a book for about 4 or 5 years before it comes out. But these are actually rather fresh work. But it's also a question of timing. So the hybridity and the different genres partly reflect the sort of nuanced differences and fragmentation that we are surrounded by. So it's many icebergs floating, and we are all sitting on top of different icebergs. And it reminded also, part of it is also alludes to the, well, of course, climate change and global warming. So the way atolls and ice caps are sort of becoming like little islands. And I remember about 15, 20 years ago, I think it was about 15 years ago, completely by chance, I chanced upon a television interview with the president of Kiribati. Kiribati is an island nation in the Pacific. And the interviewer was asking very erudite question about human rights and educational policy. And what he actually said was, really what I'm most concerned about are my people. The island of Kiribati, the nation of Kiribati, is only 6.5 feet above the Pacific. And apparently that is the first island, the nation that will be underwater. And he says, will you be taking our citizens to your country? What do I do? We will all be homeless. I mean, it's just such an astonishing fact for that time. Of course, people are much more in tune with things. So a lot of different things came together. So I thought the pastiche mosaic structure sort of fits the metaphor of our times.
And can I ask you, Sudeep, who did the actual design? Because I thought the graphic design of the book is actually quite beautiful as well. The layout, the typography, and some of those elements. Were you responsible for that?
Actually, I did it.
Wow.
I did it because, I actually do a lot of cover design and layout design for publishers. In any case, not under my name, under my company's name. So this was a good opportunity, to get all those things together. So yes, thank you. Yeah. And the publisher was generous enough because, I wanted to use a lot of white space, which simply meant that the book is going to be thicker than normal, which meant more expense. But they ran with it. And they, not only that, I think Penguin, Random House India, who are distributing the book, have also printed it. And it's beautifully done, hardback with silver foil, and it's just gorgeously produced. So I'm really lucky and thrilled, yes.
And, one of the other things I notice about it is both local and universal simultaneously. And so you evoke the rising Ganges and the burning Ghats and the heat of New Delhi, but then threaded through it is this kind of global awareness. There's quotes from Stanley Kubrick and Michael Ondaatje, and that was part of your intent, no doubt, to connect the local to the universal in some way through this work.
It's not even so much about intentionality, really. That's the kind of person I am. It's both. It's, the word that is used these days is global, global and local together. That's the way I grew up. I mean, even before I ever left Delhi or India, I grew up in a trilingual family with Bangla being spoken, Punjabi on the streets, Sanskrit is, instead of Latin, is what we studied in school. English was just one more mother tongue. And so much of Western literature, sadly, I mean, it was good and bad. I mean, my English literature course had very little or no Indian literature in it. It was mostly the Western canon. So all these things sort of, come in a sort of, like, as we know, South Asians, we as South Asians, we are very lucky. It's not unusual for any of us to speak 3 languages and read and write more and so on. So it's just a blessing of where we are born and the kind of sociological environment we are in.
Yeah, I think it is a natural extension of your personality, but for the reader, it makes this point very eloquently that these things that are describing are related to all of us, no matter where we live. It's a kind of shared human connection, which kind of brings me to my next question, which is, do you feel like as a creative person, as a poet and a photographer, that there isn't some obligation to engage with things like climate change, environmental issues? I mean, the danger, of course, is that poetry becomes polemics and politics, right? And so how do we negotiate that line between, the aesthetic sensibility and the kind of the conscience of a people that we might want to express?
No, it's a very good question. So, I mean, one of the ways I could answer this is I normally do not do too many commissions. Because you're forced into writing in a particular shape or a container, and sometimes it can work, but oftentimes poetry, I don't know. I mean, of course, all of us are very skilled. We can sort of whip off a canzone or a sestina if we want to, because we've been trained. But I feel the best kind of writing happens when a combination of the heart and the mind work in consonance. So if you think of a sound mixing board, how we calibrate the treble, the mid-range, the bass, the sonics of language and the music of language, on how we vary things. So that's terribly, terribly important in many ways. I should just so therefore, the climate change thing. How can one, as a sensitive writer, not possibly respond to what's happening around us? People have talked about politics in my poetry, but the politics in my poetry, as you know, is very disguised. It's very, very couched. And that's a hard thing to do, because if you're really angry or if you want to put a point across, the danger is exactly what you said. It becomes polemical.
Yeah.
But poetry has to rise beyond that. The poem, the only way we can think a poem is successful if it sort of outlives us. I may be responding to, say, climate change or Trump foolery or whatever it is. There's a haiku which alludes to that. But the fact is, we are talking about a larger phenomenon, and to have a larger phenomenon work, you have to partly universalize things, partly also make it very personal without it being angst-ridden. So if it's not angst-ridden and personal, then people relate to your work in a kind of a meaningful, emotional way. And the emotional connect is very, very important. I'll tell you a little story. The first 3 books I wrote were very formal, very, very formal. And of course, I was growing up at a time when Nissim Ezekiel, Kolatkar, Tom Moraes, they were all alive, and we were very fortunate to sort of hang out with them and so on. So I remember taking my 3rd book, New York Times, which is very, very formal, to Tom Moraes. He was living in Sargent House in Colaba then, and gave it to him. And it was a long evening, and he never talked about my book. And of course, as a young poet, I was itching to hear what he actually had to say. And so before I left in the evening, which was 4 or 5 hours later, after much food and drink and merriment, I said, Dom, what did you think of my poetry? And he said one thing which, as a 20-year-old, I was maybe 22, 23-year-old, I was shattered. He said, Sudeep, I miss the vulnerability that was there in some of your early poems. And at the time, I didn't realize what he meant. I was completely broken, heartbroken. And, the rage of youth was where I came out of the flat and just chucked the book on the pavement, very dramatic. But it's only much later what I realized what he said. It's this calibration of the two things That is what is. I mean, Dom Moraes' poetry is typical of that. It's very English in tonality. At the same time, he's writing from the heart of Bombay. So how, and that automatically partly answers your earlier question, becomes global and local, because many of our metaphors and many of our erudition, beyond the fact that we know our maybe Sanskrit or Punjabi or Bangla or Hindi, is also, there's a commonality of cultural references, whether it's music, whether it's a certain kind of book or certain kind of food, certain kind of societal norms, which again is not necessarily, not that many people are lucky to have that kind of space. So it's a combination of all this. So yes, there's so much embedded in that question that one can go on. But to illustrate it, perhaps I should read a poem.
Yes, please. I was going to ask you to read a poem. Yes, please.
Yeah, this particular poem that I'm going to read, it's called Disembodied, and it's very, very much located in Delhi. But as you'll see, it's very, very universal, and the references are, biblical to, you'll see what it is. It doesn't require any explanation except for the fact that it was written during the early part of the lockdown, and also during, the Delhi weather is brutal in winter, and I'm asthmatic, so the pollution was horrible. So partly it comes from there. So this one's called Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worship, not for its blessings, but its contour. Artificial shape, shaped by Nautilus. Skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains. Skeleton strengths not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there is too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass.
Thank you, Sudeep. I'm glad that I was going to ask you to read a poem, and so that was the perfect place for it. and I noticed actually that it is dedicated to Amitav Ghosh. And when we were talking about this a little bit, I brought up this book that I'm sure you know well, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And, you know, in this book, part of what he does is he traces the history of industrialization and capitalism from the moment that the British arrived in the first Opium War to corral the Chinese, and then all the way up into US imperialism and what has been happening. And I noticed in your poem, you mentioned Nautilus, you mentioned L'Oreal, these kind of corporations. And his idea was that we need a total paradigm shift to set things right, that capitalism itself by its very nature is averse to something like protecting the environment. And I don't know if you agree. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, how can you not agree? I mean, it's not just his point of view, but just generally what's happening. I mean, and, you know, the irony is, of course, the promoters of sustainable energy, stopping global warming, carbon emission, the promoters are the biggest defaulters. I mean, America, for instance, is the largest emitter of carbon footprint and gases. The methane layers are getting knocked out. But for their own country, they have a different set of rules. And for the rest of the world, there's a different set of rules. So if the other countries default on what is a prescriptive kind of model set up by America and say NATO or whatever it is, largely America, I think, the other countries will have sanctions, whereas, you know, America can go scot-free. So the real problem is a problem of deceit, a problem of untruth,
yes,
a problem of slipperiness. So the thing is, you know, when you're sitting outside that particular paradigm, you know, you tune into, say, Al Jazeera, for instance, and you get a very, very different angle. It's a very, very fine news channel, for instance. So on a given day, I would sort of watch 4 news channels, and I know which ones to watch at what time. So it'll be, say, NDTV, and then the Hindi news, and then Al Jazeera, CNN, and BBC. And only then you get some sense of parity. Whereas, if you just watch CNN, God forbid, Fox News, then it's a completely insane worldview. So of course, I mean, you know, any sensible person with any knowledge, with any kind of historical background will realize the limitations of these things. Capitalism in its own way is not a bad thing. But when it's misused, as opposed to, then there's a problem. So we're talking about balance, really. And that goes back to the Vedic times. I mean, you know, ultimately, what are we all seeking is truth and balance and calm. Whereas, excuse me, the capitalistic society actually is quite the opposite. It promotes noise, excess information like diarrhea, and very little comprehension. I'm, of course, being dramatic because to drive home a point, but that's largely what it is.
Yeah. And Heather, did you want to jump in here for a second?
I agree with everything that he said. You know, being from America, you know, the problem that I see going on here is that, you know, the capitalism is like a disease. People are so afraid of the idea of having a, you know, the mixed model economy, you know, where you have the socialism with medicine and things like that, and everything has to become a capitalistic idea. You know, there's no balance there. The entire world has got that set up, and then here we are. You know, we're just the odd man out, and we just can't have that. And, you know, the reasoning has gone out the window, and, you know, being the biggest polluter. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we have a lot to make up for. We should be leading this charge. We should be, you know, being responsible to other countries. And I think we owe other countries that. And I just agree with everything that he said. So I could probably go on quite a while about that. But I think the poem has to be dramatic to drive home a point, and I think it's done beautifully, you know.
Yeah.
No, thank
absolutely.
you, Heather. I mean, actually, what I will read is a very, very short poem because it links up with Heather, which is the complete opposite of Disembodied. It's a tiny poem which opens the book. It's called That Is. And it's titled I.E. And it was written for my son Arya. And of course, when I sent the poem to him, he's like all children tend to be, very matter of fact. He says, Baba, it's really beautiful, but I have no idea what you're talking about. You know, it's completely mysterious. But that was the whole idea. You know, there's some things you don't have to sort of, there's something beautiful about ephemerality. Something beautiful. That's the whole idea. When the soul seeks for something, if you have the answers to everything, how do you seek anything? So this is a short poem. Just enjoy it for what it is. And then after that, we'll play the song video version of it, which Heather beautifully composed and sung. So I think it's a good time to do that because Heather just spoke. And the poem, without any of the fanfare of beautiful images, visual images, and orchestral score, is simply this way. That is. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. So perhaps we should see the...
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf, you hear the sea. Because I consider the sea silent, you hear its silence in my studio. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. Because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf, you hear the sea. Because I consider the sea silent, you hear its silence in my studio. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves.
Beautiful. And Heather, thank you both so much for that. Do you want to talk about the nature of this collaboration, Heather?
Sure. I've been a big fan of SUDEEP's poetry for a very long time. Probably 2008, I discovered him in a Everyman Library anthology of Indian love poems, and I think it was Desire was in that anthology, and I
Yes,
just
I
loved
think
it.
it was edited by Meena Alexander as part of the Everyman series. Indian love poems or Indian erotic poems? Yes.
And Indian love poems, but the ending
I was
of
the
that
youngest
poem-
poet in that.
Oh my God, I love that
It
poem.
started off with Kalidas and so on, but yes, yes. Gosh, you have
Yeah.
that book. I don't even have a copy of that.
Oh no, I'm gonna get you one. Anyway, it's so beautiful, and I just have always admired his writing, and so I follow him on Facebook and everything. And then he had invited me to one of his conclave. He has these events where he'll have poets on, and I think it was earlier in the year, I believe. And he had invited me and many other poets, and so I got to go on there, and I was just really enjoying it and everything. And we ended up talking afterwards, and he said, "So you write music?" And he said, "I've always wanted to have my poetry, I'd like to collaborate with people and have my poetry done to music." And I said, "Sure, let's, take one of my poems and, we'll try it out and see how it turns out." And so my husband has his own sound studio. And so we kind of live in a studio in a kind of a garret. And so that's how I met my husband about 10 years ago. And so I said to my husband, I said, "Well, let's see what we can do with this." And so we tried one of his poems, and we did one version which had like garage band loops and things like that, which is how I used to write. And then I just did a second version of Banyan, which is all piano, where I'm playing piano and singing. And so he liked it, and so here we go. We're continuing to collaborate. We're working on his poem The Gift of Light currently, and making it kind of into a psychedelic kind of song, kind of reminiscent of Pink Floyd, Moody Blues, that kind of thing.
Wonderful. And Sudeep, what about the images and the filming?
This is all Heather. It's all Heather. Actually, I got a double gift. We were just thinking of making an album, just an acoustic album, an album without any images. But Heather started putting this video together, and I said, "My goodness me!" And so it's all her. It's entirely her. Of course, when we were doing the rough cut, I had some suggestions and so on, but it's completely largely her, really. And there's another beautiful one which we can play. It's only 2 or 3 minutes, called Banyan. Again, it's her. But of course, the thing is, because it's Heather's project, and I have such a strong sense of aesthetics, I don't want to really get into it, because then it becomes my film. Because I've got a degree in filmmaking. I've made 8 films, and I don't want to enter that space. I just want to stop where the poem stops.
Yeah.
And it's her project. So in a sense, it's a beautiful gift from a person, a duo, husband and wife duo, who I've never met. And hopefully at some point, I've only seen the photographs of this really crazy studio. I've not seen so many analog music equipment, like proper RCA jacks and, old-fashioned amps and so on. It's fantastic, because I'm just so anal about those things. I have an old typewriter, which I still guard. I still write with a fountain pen or a pencil, not a ballpoint. So, so that kind of aesthetics is also wonderful. The analog as opposed to digital.
It's all analog, and it's all tube-based.
So it's been going really well. So let's see what happens, and then we'll see. So far, so good. We've got wonderful feedback, and thanks to Heather and Mark.
I think that this book just kind of naturally lends itself to those kinds of collaborations by the very hybridity that we were talking about.
Yeah.
And which brings me to one section of the book, section 5, that I was hoping you could speak to, Sudeep. This is the skyscapes section. And you did something that Claude Monet used to do, which was he would go out at different times of the day to paint the cathedral at Arles or the water lilies. And the lighting is different, the weather is different. And you did the same thing from your rooftop, and you took photographs every day, and you accompanied them with some text. And so talk to a little bit about that. What was your intention by doing that in that section of the book?
So, the initial days of the lockdown, we were not allowed to leave our home, the physical perimeter of our home. So fortunately for some of us who have access to our terrace was the only place where you could interact with nature. So every evening, we would be up on the terrace, and it was, in a sense, a really wonderful old-fashioned way of dealing with neighbors, because everybody was on their terrace. We were shouting across to each other, the way we used to do before, loudly waving, people taking photographs. And of course, photography is side B of my life. I thought to myself, I was taking some pictures in any case, but I didn't think of it as a project. But then I realized when I was looking at the images, I was shooting the same frame. There was this tree and the skyscape behind that tree. Then I told myself, let me challenge myself and give this limitation. It's going to be the same frame I'm going to shoot every day. So either it's going to be an incredibly banal, boring catalog of images, or you can push it in a very subtle kind of way. And I'm glad you talk about Monet, because many painters do that. Because what is painting? It's actually a play of light. Photography is simply how you control light, nothing else. At the simplest level, how much you open the shutter is what determines what the image is going to be. It's just as simple as that. So I like to get back to basic, to the analog, to that written text, the handwriting, which is why the reason one of the poems is, to digress, is dedicated to Michael Ondaatje, is because I remember reviewing his book, Handwriting, and he went back to the source of scriptures and actually etchings in the wonderful caves of Sirigiriya in Sri Lanka, and how the loops and formation of letters has its own kind of music. So yes, to go back to that, I said, let me try this. And again, I said, well, color photographs, of course, the publishers are going to say no, it's expensive. But, my publisher ran with it. I'm just really, really grateful. I've been very, very lucky with this book. They just ran with it. And the text you see below each frame are just lines and fragments from poems from all over my book. So that's like a little puzzle. So there was one review which mistakenly thought they were freestanding haiku, but they're actually just fragments which look like haiku, which are little bits of poems from all over the book. So it was my little kind of way of threading everything together, bringing in the visual aspect of photography and so on, because image making is so critical and so central to poetry, whether it's images in terms of word images or in terms of photography. It's a still life, and it's actually more challenging because in an aspect ratio of 4:3 or 16:9, it's not that easy to control nuance unless you know what you're doing with shutter speed and aperture and so on. So it takes you back to basics, which is, so that's the insert. That's why it's there. And very rarely do you get a chance to play with so many different genres and put it all together in one book. And it was the process of final selection and editing was unique, because I almost became like an orchestral conductor to see whether the bass section is working, whether the drums are in the right place, or whether the harpist is doing their job correctly. Because also in terms of architecture of the book, you need to pace the book in a particular way so that it is ultimately a song.
Yeah.
The book is not just about doom and gloom, about climate change and global warming. The last section is all about consolation, hope. And without hope, we cannot possibly go on. That's the only thing that keeps us going. And let's face it, I think human beings have become so smart. They think that they're know-all. But the sun doesn't complain. It rises every day without complaining. The birds come to the same tree. The neem tree outside my house became a kind of a microcosm for what was happening. They happily come, they nest, they do their thing. It's only us who become angst-ridden. So there's lot to learn from that. And I will have to read this little quote which ends the book. It's a 3-line quote from this wonderful Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz. And I'll just quote that because that's the message we need to take back. And he simply says, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all this a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow."
I wanted to allow Priti to ask a question or two as well, because I know that you also had some thoughts and ideas. So would you like to join our discussion?
Thanks, Ravi. Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone over most of the stuff that I'd put down anyway, but maybe SUDEEP would like to talk a little bit about the solitude, I mean, not only pandemic imposed, but the kind of solitude a writer or a poet needs, shutting yourself away and writing, and how comfortable you are with that and what that means to you in your own. I mean, I've seen your study and it's fabulous, and that window with the neem tree and all that. So anybody could stay there forever, but tell us about that.
So unfortunately, because it's so beautiful, I've become obsessively kind of mole-like. I don't like to leave that room at all. And it doesn't make for very good social life or health, because I'm planted, I'm in that room most of 16 hours of the day or 14 hours of the day, I'm there. But apart from that, to answer your question more seriously, writers, for us, when these so-called new words that were being bandied about, quarantine, isolation, of course, the context is very specific. For us, that is the life I always led. Most of the time, 90% of my time is actually with myself and with my books and with whatever little I choose to surround myself, which is why many poets are super gregarious in the evening, because that's our vent, So in literature festivals, as you know, in the evenings, my God, the writers can talk, and talk. But that's because they haven't talked for 10 months of the year, if you really squeeze all that in. So yes, so solitude is something which is normal and essential. So it wasn't a problem at that level. I think the problem most of us were facing vis-a-vis solitude and isolation was the fact that we couldn't actually travel. Because you're in a solitary space, one of the sparks of inspiration and oxygen is when you travel for literature festivals or lecture tours, book tours. That's where you meet people, you get feedback, you sell books, whatever, So that's a little bit of reality, because we live in an unreal world. We live in a bubble. We are strange people. I mean, I tell myself, poets we have these 3 antennas. Of course, most people have 2 ears and it's a stereophonic sound. But poets discovered a quadraphonic system way before stereo or a single speaker sound was, because we had this invisible antenna on top of our forehead, like a little elephant, which is transparent. And it picks up these phrases, sounds, snatches of conversation, unheard music. We make up things and we collect all that through our system and bury it somewhere. And then those are materials that, make us write, I suspect. So yes, self-imposed isolation for most people was difficult, but for us, it's just normal, So at one level, if you want to be very blasé, I said, what is all this fuss about, But yes, it is not easy when it's so long and you can't meet people and travel,
Yeah. And then the other bit that, of course, I find, and which Ravi's already brought up earlier, is this role of the artist not to look away, but to be a commentator or a chronicler
Yes.
of the time that you live in. I find that fascinating because, I mean, just to be in the, in some kind of realms of passion and love and whatever you associate with poetry, but to go beyond that and to actually be making a commentary on what's going on around you, to be very much in the present.
Yeah, which is why this book is so interesting. For instance, when the book's been sent out for reviews various places and is doing, it's doing well. But I remember the editor of The Week wrote back saying, we are going to send this book to our science reporter to review. And I was so thrilled because, it gets beyond the so-called lit crit, academic crit, the people who know about literature. I mean, I know what they're going to say. I mean, I know the language they use. But for a science person to write about the book is exciting. The first public program I did was the Norwegian Climate Change Association and their Writers Association invited me to talk to them. I mean, it's sort of when it goes completely beyond the scope of just pure literature, poetry, is you realize that, something like this is actually worth doing, worthwhile. And the resonances are just much, much beyond the Eliotesque, Shakespearean, Kalidasa spaces. And in any case, when we are talking about all these people, they actually write about the world and what's around us. Any good writer is incredibly engaged with the politics and geography and terrain and society around them. So when you're talking about love poetry or poetry of grief, it's one tiny sliver of a larger canvas. Most good writers, if you go beyond the surface of the writing, is actually talking about a lot of complex things. The thing about poetry, of course, is the space is very little. So it becomes very hard. So it's a very specific skill to have to kind of put together so many things. So that's why, a small poem is like a whole world unto itself. So many of my friends, of course, many of my friends are novelists. And of course, I've met various literary agents to them, and they all, and this was a while ago, they all thought I was writing this big Indian novel. So they were very nice to me in the sense that they said, okay, poetry, all very well, but when can we see the novel? I said, it's not as though I'm closed to writing a novel, but I know I can write two good novels. One is a kind of disguised version of my life. The second novel will be all the things I left out in the first novel will make the second novel because we have the wherewithal of language and all that. Do I really have the desire to write a third novel? I told myself, the answer was really no, So if I don't have a third good book, there are so many one novel wonders. So poetry, though it's very hard, it's something that, you want to really engage with and sustain. And every book of mine is so different from a book before that. It's a nightmare for critics because they can't pigeonhole me at all. My academic colleagues, they said, you're a nightmare, complete nightmare, because, you're not a post-colonial, yet you're an eco-poet, you defy that, but you're not, you're feminist, but at the same time, you're not. You have the mythological aspect of this thing. So someone wrote a paper on the temple imagery in my poetry. I said, my God, I mean, the gods are really angry with me because I hardly ever go and pray, the heathen I am. But it answers your question in a sense that, your palette is so broad that the macrocosm becomes the microcosm. And that's the beauty of poetry because it's a very distilled art form. Less is more.
Yeah.
Less is more.
But it's also, I mean, does it just flow? Do you work on it again and again? How does that?
So
I mean, for somebody who knows nothing about poetry, in the sense of, how does the impulse actually really strike you, and how does this happen?
So it's the old-fashioned way. I mean, it's recollection and tranquility, or you have this sort of demonic moment where Indra's lighting strikes you and you have the first seed of a poem. Of course, that's important. But that to me is only the germ of the poem. to make that poem work takes a long time. So when I look at my callow poetry when I was writing in school and my undergraduate days, they were much more spontaneous in a sense, but the depth perhaps wasn't there. Maybe it was there, who knows? But when I move back now, we've become more skilled. It's a question of skill. So, it's like I sit down with poetry for 2 hours every day. And it's not as though I can write a new poem. I wish I could, But often when I'm not writing, I'm reviewing someone else's book of poetry or just reading book of poetry. And when I talk about poetry, it's fairly broad-based. I could be actually deconstructing a jazz album because that's also lyric-based poetry. Or an album of Police or Sting is a certain kind of poetry. So those 2 hours are like my riyaz. And it's completely critical because without that, it's not possible. And the fact that initially, and Ravi teaches creative writing, I sporadically teach creative writing. And when we were first told that, write in form, write a sonnet, as young poets, oh, come on, is it relevant? Why do we need to write an Alexandrine or a Shakespearean sonnet? It's completely not relevant. But why is it relevant? Because you learn the craft. Because even if you want to be Stravinsky, you need to know the form to break the form. Otherwise, you're working in a vacuum. And when talking about form, dance, classical dance is such a big obsession of mine that feeds into my writing a lot. And, classical dance is so strict and, based on a particular format that sort of, enters my poetry in a particular way. So now it's a combination of both. Think about Azharuddin, our former Indian captain and cricketer. When he does a beautiful leg glance of, say, Jeff Thompson or one of those West Indian fast bowlers, it looks silky, impossibly silky. But why? Because he spent like 20 hours on the net just doing that stroke. That's what it's all about.
Mm. So I'm handing it back to you, Ravi. And I think we still have another of Heather's lovely compositions to listen to.
Great.
So whether you want to do it now or
we can do it now.
With
we can do it now. I think it'll be a nice
Yes,
break.
sure. Makes me think of Yeats saying, if it does not seem a moment's thought, all our stitching and unstitching has been not. Right. So it gives the impression of spontaneity, and in fact, it's much, much labored over. Okay, this is Banyan, huh? Do you want to introduce this or set this up in any way?
No, just Banyan. It's about tree. It's not the Hindi word banyan, but it's Banyan.
Banyan.
The tree itself.
As winter secrets melt with the purple sun, what is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. Notes tune, unknown scales. Syntax alters tongues. Terracotta melts white. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. Banyan ribbons into ornators. is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. Italicized and invisible ink, letters never posted, photographer's map, uncharted, as phrases fall, so do veils, as phrases fall, so do veils. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric. What is revealed is electric.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And you get a lot of comments coming through in the chat. Someone says your voice reminds them of Joan Baez.
Thank you.
And someone wants to know the instrument. Is it a sarod or what kind of instrument were you using?
Okay, yes, there are some sarod loops in this. One thing that I like to mess around with is I like to do electronic music in the box. A lot of these are loops and things. I love sarods. I love different kinds of tablas and different kinds of rhythm. By trade, I play piano and harp on my own when I'm composing, and I like to do a lot of just voice and harp and things, but this is really different for me. This was me messing around. My husband and I sat down and I said, I have this idea, and he said, well, why don't you try playing with these loops in GarageBand, see, combine them, see how they do with this song, see what kind of textures you can get. And so a lot of that is just so I think it's sarod, tabla, some different keyboards and synthesizer sounds and things like that, and just the combination of him working with me in the studio to record and layer voices and things. So
one of the things I must say that I let Heather do the first two songs because I didn't want to critique it too much before we fell into a pattern. But I did tell her at some point, once the two songs were done, because we've been talking about it a lot, is do not use an Orientalist's lens. Just because I'm Indian, sarod necessarily doesn't have to come in. So then she's of course said, we'll be using. So the next poem, which is called The Gift of Light, is very, very Pink Floyd-ish, punk and whatnot. Because, when you hear Heather sing other songs, if you go to YouTube or on her website, my God, she can be a punk artist or a rocker, proper rocker. So this is a very, very different voice. I'm also very, very cognizant of the fact that the chat box is buzzing and there are lots and lots of questions. So we must keep 10 minutes for a Q&A if people have it. But before that, I just want to read one poem because it's the last poem of the book. And I want to definitely end with hope because that's what it's all about. There's no other more valuable currency than hope and love. And many people might pick up because Agha Shahid Ali is a really popular poet in India. There are lots of devotees of Shahid. So there are two lines of Shahid that I use within the poem. And it's called Om, a Cerement. And it opens with a quote from Goethe, architecture of frozen music. In my city, I'm surrounded by constant cries of the dying, burning pyres heaving under burden of wood, smoke, and bones. wailing summed up by sonic notes of Om. Civilization's first sound, Sanskrit syllable echoing a conch shell harmonic mapping, its involute spiral geometry holding within and emanating airborne sonar screams. My ancestors, grandmothers, mother, blew into the smooth shell cupped in their palms, held intimately as if it were a talisman, a prayer, a pranayam in yoga's daily ritual. But breathing is such a privilege these days. Pandemic struck, oxygen deprived, my friends perish, the country buckles, airless. Even an exquisite cerement lacks the sheen or wax to wrap the contours of a corpse now. Each day as I write endless condolence notes, etching dirge-like couplets on gravestones, my city continues to be dug up, not to make space for burial sites, but for palaces of illusion, an architecture of frozen music, greed, calumny. A country without a government, a country without a post office, Shahid laments. Let me cry out in that void, say it as I can. I write on that void. Om's celebration, now an unceasing requiem. Yet we chant in hope for peace. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Thank you, Sudeep. It's really nice to have that note of consolation and hope. And there was a request, and if anyone has questions, by all means, please put it in the chat. Sudeep would be glad to take any of them. There was a request for you to read one of your Bharatanatyam poems. In there,
I'll have to fetch that. Just give me a second.
Oh, okay.
You can talk.
Okay. Well, this is great. And Priti, what else is happening at Maja House coming up? Is there anything that people should look out for?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've got programs every weekend. So tomorrow we have Pavan Verma, who's a politician, a writer, and ex-bureaucrat, whose new book is called The Great Hindu Civilization. So we're having a discussion on that tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. Happy for everybody to join in.
Yes, and I'm sure everyone can look at the website and social media to see what is happening. It looks like great programming set up. And then Sudeep is looking for, and there's so much in Vedic aesthetics that is really deeply profound for me as well, rasa theory. And I think when reading Sudeep's poems, there's so many different rasas that you inhabit, and I think that's one of the testaments to the strength of this book is that it's really quite far ranging. So you do have a Bharatanatyam poem for us?
I do. But it's good that you bring up the rasa theory. But also in Bangla or in Hindi or in Urdu, there's a word called ras. Or in Bangla we said rosh. No, that's the essential music of poetry. So without rosh or ras, there can be no poetry. And of course, the rasa theory is a very theoretical sort of thing altogether. But yes, thank you for asking for Bharatanatyam Dancer. It's a very old poem. It's like this request. Every time I do readings, everybody wants me to read Bharatanatyam Dancer. And it's, of course, going to be part of my next book, which is called The Whispering Anklet, Payal, which is all about dance, classical Indian dance and so on. And talking about form, we were talking about architecture and form. And I have to tell you about the form of this poem. It uses a rhyme scheme, which is ABACCA. And the reason I do that is when I was watching the dancer dance, the rag, the bowl and the tal of the rag she was dancing to was ta dhin ta tai tai ta, ta dhin ta tai tai ta. So I told myself, why can't I replicate that particular meter, that rhyme scheme? So ta dhin ta tai tai ta became ABACCA, ABACCA. And of course, this has not been done in English poetry. So, similarly, this is a new form that's been invented. So it's a lot of fun doing that sort of stuff. Each, they are not end-stopped rhymes. So they are wraparound so that I don't want the reader to be consciously aware of the rhyme scheme because I want it to be muted. And if people read it often enough, they get the whole story. But in any case, the reason I wrote this poem was I saw this dancer dancing on the stage and I was completely agog, I was stunned to silence. I mean, I fall in love every time I go to a dance performance, I fall in love with a dancer. It's completely one way, of course. So this was just one more moment. Bharatanatyam dancer for Leela Sampson. Spaces in the electric air divide themselves in circular rhythms as the slender grace of your arms and bell-tied ankle describe a geometric topography, real, cosmic, one that once reverberated continually in a prescribed courtyard of an ancient temple in South India. As your eyelids flit and flirt and match the subtle abhinay in a flutter of eyelashes, the pupils create an unusual focus. Sight, only ciliary muscles blessed and cloaked with celestial kajal could possibly enact. The raw brightness of Kanjivaram silk, of your breath, and the nobility of antique silver adorns you and your dance, reminding us of the treasure chest that is only half exposed, disclosed just enough, barely, for art in its purest form never reveals all. Even after the arc lights have long faded, the audience now invisible stayed over. Here I can still see your pirouettes, frozen as time-lapse exposures. Feel the murmuring shadow of an accompanist's intricate rag in this theater of darkness. A darkness where oblique memories of my quiet Kalakshetra days filter, matching your very own of another time, where darkness itself is sleeping light, light that merges, reshapes, and ignites, dancing delicately in the half-light. But it is the sacred darkness that endures, melting light with desire, desire that simmers and sparks the radiance of your quiet femininity, as the female dancer now illuminates everything visible, clear, poetic, passionate, and ice pure. Thank you for asking.
Yes, great. Thank you, Sudeep. A few questions coming in here. Are the poems in Anthropocene only a lament on the loss of nature, or are there poems of celebration as well?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of poetry with celebration of nature. Yeah. I mean, we were talking about the architecture before. So it starts off with the pandemic, and then I explore global warming. And then there's a section called Holocene, which is essentially poems about geographies or geographies. And the wonderful thing is the neem tree outside my house is a central character in this particular book. So I'm so happy to make that as part of my poetic construct. I remember when as a child, the MCD, which is the local municipal department, the tree kind of bent. So they thought it's going to be a danger and it's going to fall. And they wanted to cut that tree off. And I remember the Chipko movement, we said, no way, you're not going to cut this tree. And this tree has become like a natural curtain. And neem, as you know, is a wonderful filter. Every part of the root system and the leaves and all that used for herbal medicines and so on. So yeah. There's a lot of positive. I mean, in fact, the book is largely positive. It's 80% positive. The darkness is there, but it's covered with light. The light wins at the end, always.
And another question here has to do with your title and this idea of the Anthropocene, and that in science, people ponder the teleology of the Anthropocene, the kind of the function and the purpose. And so what could the teleology of your poetry be in this new domain of the Anthropocene?
It would be very presumptuous of me to answer such a question. Who are we really? We are just mere specks in the human horizon. All these wonderful analysis is only valid, I think, if our poems last beyond our own lifetime. So we'll see. But the fact that my poems resonate with such a cross-section of people is a sense of blessing, I think. Because I come from such a strict English lit background, even though I did science, that, people think that, you're writing for the academy. And I always say that my poetry is for any interested reader. And I can see that happening now because the readership is across so many different platforms, so many different subject matters. As I said, climate change organization was one of the first ones to come and interview me from Norway. How would I have ever thought that would have happened? So yes, I mean, yeah, we just do what we can do and, make a difference. I mean, I don't start out being a Mother Teresa, but, we can influence small things. And for us, the biggest tool is metaphor, writing, phraseology, and openness and vulnerability and truth, whatever the truth might be. Unfortunately, the only people who govern us is our mind. Even though in new technology we are trolled and so on and so forth, but at least writers and artists are still the only few places where you're free, somewhat, depending on the country you're in. So yes, it's an ongoing journey, and every book is a challenge. I never thought Anthropocene. I never set out to write this book. That's the beauty of it. And it happened. And the way it's kind of spread its wings. I mean, Heather is a good example. She's making an album out of it. It's being translated into Bangla. The US and UK edition is going to be coming out on the 2nd of December. And it's just, yes. So it's thanks to all of you, really. I feel grateful.
And so I would be remiss not to ask if you can give us some hints, Sudeep, of what is next. We know that you always like to change your projects and you're always doing something new. Not to give it away completely, but do you have any things kicking around?
Yeah, I did mention the book I'm working on, which is called The Whispering Anklet.
Oh, yes.
Which is on classical Indian dance. Again, I didn't set out to write a book on classical Indian dance at all. It's just that it's been my obsession for 35 years. My mother was an amateur dancer. Some of my closest friends are professional dancers. So I've watched dance very, very closely, and I've written on it, both prose and poetry. And so it's in a kind of algorithmic graph aggregation of all the work I've been doing in dance. Now, I've got the poems are all written, actually. It's a question of, just designing the book. So initially I thought, okay, I'll have Bharatanatyam. The Bharatanatyam section will have photographs of Bharatanatyam dancer. The Kathak will have photographs of Kathak, Mohiniyattam, Kalaripattu, and so on. And then I started writing to my dancer friends. I'm not going to name any. And then it was another world of politics opened out, So, who's going to be on the cover of the book? Are you using a close-up of my photograph, or is it going to be in color or black and white? I said, I am not going to deal with this. I'm going to just go for very, very abstract photography. So the photography has been shot. It's a close-up of an eyelash, or a macro of a ghungru, or a swirl of the sheer Kathak dress. So I asked my friend, who's I think one of our top dancers in India, called Aditi Mangaldas. I said, would you can you model for me? So she said, I'll be happy to, but all my gurus will be screaming against me because they are alive, because there's a whole hierarchy of dance. And so I said, don't worry, it's a poetry book. So I take the decision. And our very dear friend, Dinesh Khanna, who's the photographer, who does these incredible photography. So he has shot all the pictures of Aditi. The photographs are all there. The poetry is all there. Now I need a brilliant designer to just marry it together, because it's a kind of a book that requires a lot of different elements to come together. I did it with Anthropocene, but this is very specific. And in a particular way, it's also a book of dance criticism, except written through poetry. We lost so many dancers. In fact, one of our biggest critic, Sunil Kothari, who died earlier this year, he was supposed to write an introduction to this book. He said, I write all these critics which are so dry, and you just write this poem and it's not fair because you've actually critiqued the whole show with the poem. So yeah, that's what I'm working on, really. Yeah.
I love that movement too. I mean, the Bharatanatyam is a narrative dance form, and here you are kind of retranslating it back into verse in a way. So that will be really fascinating. Anyone else have any questions? I'm cognizant of the fact that we're getting close to the end of our session. We can always have Sudeep leave us with a small poem as a kind of outro. And I think in the chat, there's a WhatsApp number and other things where you can connect with Maja House. I think at the beginning of the session, I mentioned I'm the chairman of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. So feel free to join, and we have a isolation break, a monthly reading series there as well. And what a fabulous session. Images, music, poetry, ideas. This is the morning for me. So this is a nice way for me to start my morning.
No, and thank you to Maja House and the visionary sort of curatorial acumen which Preeti has. I mean, it's one of those platforms which I actually watch fairly regularly, and it's usually the programs are long and sustained. It has very little cosmetics. It's hardcore, which is wonderful because there's so many programs floating around. So it's a real treat to kind of be on this show. So thank you, Preeti.
Thank you.
And the entire team.
Much.
The entire
thank you,
team.
all of you.
Yeah. And thank you, Heather.
Yeah.
And Ravi.
Yeah, I must say it was not only a fantabulous session, it was a soulful treat, not only for the ears, eyes, but of course for the soul. Island underwater, the depth of emotions, wow, wonderful. Life beneath oceans, so much to learn from you, Sudeep. So much to learn from you. The poetry, oh my God, you could never imagine that in the session of the poetry, we'll be learning the basics of the photography also. And Heather, I must say, you stole our hearts. Oh, what a divine voice, what a divine gift you have. Such a melody. And God bless you. It was such a difficult composition, but you did it so flawlessly. It is wonderful, absolutely stunning. And Dr. Ravi, hats off to you. I'm wearing a turban. I cannot take it off, but then, yeah. And I would request Preeti to bring you as a speaker or in one of the sessions of the Maja House. You're such a beautiful soul inside out. And Sudeep, at times I could feel Rumi in you. I could feel the vibes of the Sufism, not only through your words, but through your gestures, through your eyes, through your voice. It was a brilliant, fantabulous, and a very soulful session. Treat. And thank
Arvinder,
you.
you're terribly generous, but Allah ki duaएं hai sab kuch. You know, it's God's
No,
gift.
no,
We
but
are just.
honestly, I'm just sharing my heartfelt feelings. You know, what I felt it, I just spoke it out. And friend, goodbye, good day, and good day you to Heather, and good day to Dr. Ravi, and good night to everybody over here. Thanks once again. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Preeti, for bringing
Thank
such
you.
beautiful
Thank
souls
you,
to the
Arvinder. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for being here today, this evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe,
Good night.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.